Okay. Cool, we're recording. Okay, so for everyone watching at home, welcome to the YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about intermediate CSS, and specifically the topics we're going to cover are the box model and positioning. And the first one sounds like it's very conceptual, but it's actually really easy. And then the second thing seems important, how we're going to position things. What I'm also going to try to do is not read off of this very long script, because I am confident that most of you know how to read. And I want to make sure that this is actually interactive. So the demo, the game plan for today is, if possible, I'm going to run through the content here, and then I'll show you and we'll live code some stuff together that will be helpful for your portfolio website. So hopefully we can talk about how to code a navbar or a card or like stuff like that. Sound good? Liddy, okay, let's start. So the first thing I do need to talk about is the box model. So I'm not going to use this image because it's not interactive. I'm going to use this thing because it is interactive. Wow. But as we mentioned yesterday in the lecture with Leo, HTML tags, right, form the structure of your page. So when you write out a tag, like for example, the p tag or the div tag or things like that, those kind of show you, you know, this thing structurally is going to be a division or a paragraph or a heading. But as we talked about earlier, CSS is what really defines how your thing is going to look. And it turns out there's actually a not so simple algorithm that determines how big each thing is. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that in general, as this web page will demonstrate, every single tag is a box. That seems pretty simple, right? So if you have this paragraph, right, there's a box. And in this case, we've highlighted the outside of the box. In this case, these, you know, individual words, these are list items that we talked about earlier. Those are also boxes. And sometimes, right, if we add a span tag, something that Leo mentioned before, it's just a normal kind of tag, that also is another box. So everything you see on your screen, deep down, is a box. Okay, that doesn't seem very useful. The real question is, what is the point of using these boxes? And also, how do we know how big the box is? And this is the question that the CSS box model really is trying to solve. So let's take a look. We're going to talk about 4 different areas. We're going to talk about the content area, padding, border, and margin. And you can follow along the notes if you would like, or also you can just look at the screen. I'm going to cover the same kind of content, just in a slightly different way. So as this page tells you, this is the box model, and this is the hierarchy. So on the inside, we have the content. The content is your content. So if you put something on the inside of a box, right? Like for example, in this example here, this says, I'm a box, right? That is going to be the content. If you put in other tags on the inside, everything there is content. So all of that stuff is inside the content area or the content box of your page. Here, this is a code example. I've embedded a lot of code examples into the notes, but this is just to highlight the size of the content area. So here we said, hey, we're going to use a CSS property called width and height. As you might imagine, it sets the width and the height of an element. And we're going to just set it to be 300 pixels, so it's like a square. So now we can see here, the entire content area is filled in with blue. So it's not only just the text, because the text forms some content, but it's also the result of the width and the height CSS property and keyword. And as a quick reminder, if you don't remember how these things work, so this means we're referring to a class. So the dot is something, and then a class name. That's why we have the class box here. And then, oh no, I made Leo's mistake. Then this is, each of these things is called a property. The thing on the left is the name of the property or the attribute. There's a colon, and on the right, we have a value. And this is 300 pixels, the unit, it's like a dot on your screen, and a semicolon. Okay, before we move on, did that kind of gist make sense? You can use the width and the height CSS properties to change the size of your content area. Liddy? Nice. Okay. Now you're like, that was useless, right? What was the point of that? I already knew that we can use that. That's where the other areas come in. And the first one we're going to talk about is called padding. So before I explain, let's do a thinking question. What do you think padding is? I'm going to call out Peter because Peter answered my questions yesterday. Peter says area between the boxes. Interesting, interesting. That's one way you could put it. That is probably not the way I would put it, and we'll actually come across why that might not be the case later, but you're on a good point. The idea of padding is creating area around a specific box. So as you can see in this thing on the right, the padding is outside of the content, but let's go to a code example. So first we're gonna look at what an unpadded example might look like. Look at this, right? This thing right here that says, why are spiders so good at making websites? Because they're great web developers, because they're, thank you. That's the appreciation I need. If you look at it, right, the W is all the way on the boundary of the box. Same thing with the T and the M over here. And in my opinion, that doesn't actually look that great, right? Like there's not that much space, you know, it's kind of confusing to see. So it would be great if we could add some space around the edge of the content area. Does that make sense so far? So we're gonna add some space in between our entire element and where the content starts. And that's what the padding thing does. So this CSS property is called padding. And we're just gonna add 10 pixels to it. Yeah, that's not what I'm gonna do. So if we do that, this is the result we're gonna get. I also have it on this side, I guess, if it's easier to see. So if you notice here, there's this kind of invisible ring that forms all around this box that's not here. Okay, so we've now added some space. It looks a little bit nicer, still not great, but we've made some progress. Now you might say, Matt, what if I just want to add padding to the top or the bottom or the left or the right? And I would say the people who made CSS are kind of smart, and they've added different ways to do that. So there are also properties called padding top, right, bottom, left. And then the actual padding keyword applies the number you add to all of them. So it's kind of like a shorthand. And you might have heard Leo say that word earlier. So this is where padding comes into play. Padding is really useful when you want to make sure that there's some space in between your content and other things that might be the background or the border. And you'll see this time and time again when you make your own personal website and as we move towards the learning labs. So keep that in mind, very useful, spacing things out. Cool, okay. The other thing I want to, two other very quick conceptual things I want to point out. So one, if you look at the example here, right? This box, the one without the padding, is actually smaller than this box, the one that does have the padding. So padding also makes your box bigger. And that's the difference between just adding some like spaces or something on the inside of your content. This actually makes the box bigger. We're going to come back to why that's important later. The other thing I want to point out is that the stuff on the outside was orange. Why do we think it was orange? Did I set orange anywhere in the padding? Chloe, I'm going to call on you. Why is the background orange?
Because you set the color of the padding area to be orange.
Yeah, so yeah, on fleek. So the idea, right, is this thing, this is the code that created this box, right? The background of that entire thing is orange. And it turns out padding doesn't actually add a specific color. It just adds some invisible space. So, you know, you're not adding padding of any color. The padding is just natural to the background color of the element that it's in. It was kind of confusing, but that's another clear thing I want to point out. Padding is not going to really visually change your element that much. And you might ask, Matt, what if I do want padding to have a color? And that's where border comes in. That's going to be our next thing. So as you can imagine, the border is a border around the element. So border, as we can see from this nifty diagram, is outside of the padding area. And the fundamental difference between border and padding is that padding is just transparent. It's white space, right? So there's no impact visually on your box, versus border does have a color, right? And you can imagine that would make sense because the thing is called border. So I'm going to pull up the code on the left over here and the resulting example on the right. And this is another really common design pattern that you'll see when you're making your card. So you have a little card that says, I never understood 50 Shades of Gray because there are at least thousands in RGB color space. Okay, I got crickets that time. Thank you, thank you. But if you notice, so we've added some padding. Again, the padding makes sure that there's some space in between the letters and the outside of the card. Then we've added this property that says border, colon. Oh my, there's like 3 things here. What the heck? Well, if you came to Leo's thing yesterday, you already know that this is border shorthand, but if you don't, it's totally okay. We're gonna run it through with you. So how the border element works is it's actually a combination of 3 different properties. And in order, there's no way you would know this beforehand, are border width, style, and color. So the width is like how thick the border is. This is 1 pixel, so this is like slim thick. Then we have the style of the border. So it can be solid, it can be dashed. There's a whole list. Really, I only ever use solid personally, but it's up to you. And then finally, we have the color. And this time, we just wrote out the word black. And that's how we get this border around this element. Does that make sense? So the fundamental difference, the big difference between border and padding is that border has a color and it goes outside padding, while padding doesn't have a color. And usually, you'll use these 2 things together. It's very convenient. Cool. Okay, last but not least, we're gonna talk about margin. Margin is the most confusing one, so I'll spend a little bit extra time going over this one. But the idea with margin is very similar to padding and border. We're just gonna add more space outside of the element. But this time, it's on the outside of the border. So it's another utility you can use. Like padding, there's different margin values. There's top, there's right, there's bottom, there's left. And of course, there's a shorthand that applies all of them. So first, we're going to do one with just margin bottom, because I need to prove a point about something in a moment. But if you look at this, right? Before, up here, when we had no margin, there's a little bit of space, but there's not that much space. And this automatic space, we'll get to why this gets created later. You just have to buy it for now. But I want to add more space. So if we go to the margin area one, we've added extra space over here. It's very exciting, very fun. So that's going to be about 50 pixels. So it's space in between these kinds of elements to some extent. Does that make sense so far? We're just adding space on the outside. What? Okay. There is something spicy about margin though. And the spicy thing is that margins do this thing called collapsing. And this is not behavior that you get out of border or padding. And this is where things kind of get a little confusing. So let's say I attach margin just to the normal keyword. This adds margin to the top, left, right, and bottom of each element. If you look at the example over here, right? Now you've seen there's like some more space from the left compared to the top one. There's more space from the top, the right, and the bottom. But the space in between the cards didn't change. What? Why could that be? Does anyone have any guesses? Maya, I saw your hand move. I see something. What are the deets?
Because it applied the margin to every single side of the element.
Sure, yeah, so I agree. So this has a margin bottom of 50, and this has a margin top of 50. So why isn't this space 100?
It collapsed.
Peter, your name is not Maya.
Oh, I thought mine already went.
Disappointing. This is the problem that STEM has now.
Gosh.
Fine, Peter. You were correct. No, sorry. And also for everyone watching at home, Peter is a perfectly nice person. Don't attack him. So the margins do something called collapsing. And what collapsing really means is it just takes the larger of the 2 spaces, right? And that's the final value. So what's larger between 50 and 50? The answer cannot be just nodding, Peter. There has to be an answer. Peter, since you're very eager about speaking up. 50, right? So the total space here is going to be 50. And you're going to say, Matt, that's so dumb. Why don't they not have margins collapse and have it behave like padding? And the answer has to do with print media, because these terms are taken from when we used to do newspaper layout, and this is just a very common way of doing things. So this is just one of those examples. I'm just going to exit this, where inertia was a really big reason why things happen. So, but now you know margins collapse, and sometimes this is actually really, really useful. So you might be thanking people. Okay, before we go over border box, I want to make this interactive. So you guys are going to look at my Twitter account, okay? And we're going to do some real life pointing out where margins, padding, and border are, okay? So y'all, this is my Twitter. We're just going to scroll past that photo. Let's look at this tweet right here. Actually, oh, this is kind of a sad tweet. Let's see if we can find maybe a happy tweet. None of these are particularly, oh no, this is not good. Okay, this tweet right now, that's an inappropriate name. Wow, I really should have just picked a tweet earlier. That's not what you want to see. Let's look at this one. This one by Allison O'Connor seems pretty wholesome. It says, I miss my friends, but absolutely did not remember who they are or what they look like. I should have picked the ACM AI Twitter. That's what I should have done. Anyways, so does anyone see any at all cases of margin, border, or padding here? Not everyone at once.
Little borders around all the replies and the tweet itself.
Exactly. So each of these borders are all, these things are each divs or some other HTML element. And yeah, you're right. We've got borders there. Okay, margin and padding left on the table. Do we see anything on this page?
Is there margin on the left and right? So like, so because it's not like pressed, it's like in the middle.
Like this area right here that I have in my mess?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I actually don't think so. I think, oh, actually, no, there is. Yeah, you're right. This is probably margin. It might be Flexbox. We'll talk about that later. Not today. But this is probably some sort of margin. Okay, last but not least, padding. Any ideas of padding? This one's the hardest one to see, I think. Okay, Leisha, I'm gonna ask you right now. So right now we have Clubhouse here trending in California. Is this T right up at the border?
No.
So
what could that be? Padding.
Yes, there you go. So the reason why some of these things are not directly on the border is because we've added some padding. So as you can see from this real life case study, web developers use padding, margin, and border all the time. But Matt, you might say, that was a very long, confusing exercise. And I don't want to do that every time I look at a website online. And I would say that you're probably right. So let's look at a programmatic way where we can look at that. If you go to your inspect element tool and you switch to your computer screen view, you can actually see the box model in action. So if you hover over, I don't know, like this entire element, this is a tweet. There's this thing right here. I don't know how I can make this bigger. Nope. Oh no, I'm a boomer. No, what? Okay, this view called computed. This right here actually tells you these values for each of these elements. So here it says this blue thing is the content area. Then there's some padding on the sides. There's no border, there's no margin. And you can select individual elements and see what's been added. And if you notice, these names are kind of very weird. This is like garbled. This has to do with pre-processing, so don't worry about that. But you can though see where these things are added. So see this green right here indicates that there's some padding and there's actually a border at the top as well that creates that line. So in general, if you're like, wow, this website is very cool, right? pfflanders.github.io. I want to see how that was made. You can go to inspect element and actually take a look and see how each of these sites is made. Does that kind of make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. You can review the box model. Great. Okay, so that's like the hardest stuff we have to cover today, I think. Everything else is pretty intuitive. I want to mention one other thing. So there's this thing called the box sizing property. This is like the little pinch of salt that will get you that internship over someone else who's just applying and does not know this in your interview. So box sizing is a not very often talked about, but extremely important CSS property. And it has one job. All it does is it changes how width and height are calculated. So if you remember earlier, right, I said, hey, in this padding area example, this one with no padding is smaller than this one with padding. Remember this? This is making sense so far? So a lot of web developers are like, that's dumb, right? I want to specify the overall size of my thing, including the border and the padding, right? Because that's normally how you would size something. You would expect the border to be part of the element. And that's what the box sizing property does. So the normal default value is called content box. And if you think about it, box sizing, content box, what could that mean? Maya, I'm going to call you in here. What could it mean that the box sizing is content box?
That the box sizing applies to only the content. So like only the words would be 200 pixels wide or whatever.
Maya, you're a genius. That is exactly what it means. So the nice thing is, generally, I think these names are pretty indicative of what the feature is. So yeah, you're right. By default, the width and the height only affect the content box. But there's another option called border box. What could that mean? Box sizing, border box. Nisha, I'm going to call on you. What are your thoughts?
The size counts like the border, not just what's inside of it.
Beautiful. HCM AI Outreach, amazing officers. I already know everything. You guys should be teaching this course instead of me. But yeah, that's exactly right. So this now means that the width and the height will affect the border. And you're like, Matt, that was way too much time for something that seems very useless. But this actually changes like all of your code, right? Because if you think about it, if you ever rely on using width or height, which one of these is set completely changes all of the impacts of your code. And this is one really common issue that I found when I teach web development, where developers don't really know what's going on. And they're like, oh, I use Bootstrap or something. And Bootstrap changes this value. So you just want to keep this in the back of your mind. This is a problem that will exist. But also you can use it to your advantage and change the behavior if you like one or another. Did that kind of make sense? That's a little bit of a confusing topic. So if you have any questions, now is a good time. Cool. Okay. So just very quickly, I'm going to introduce some spicy terminology here. So last time with Leo, you learned about some selectors like classes or IDs or tag names. You can apply a CSS property to every single element. And that's done with the asterisk, which if you're familiar with like Linux and Unix is the glob selector for everything. But really, this line of code right here just means apply box sizing border box to everything on the page. And a lot of people do this because they like it. So just letting you know, you might see this line of code in many different frameworks or tutorials that you use, and now you know what it does. Cool, cool, cool. Okay, let's now switch gears slightly and answer a question that none of you had, which was, why is there already a space between this and this? And the answer has to do with whether or not an element is an inline element or a block element. And you're like, wow, that sounds so not sexy. And you might be right. But this is a very good example or a diagram that kind of explains what I mean. So in general, so far, we've found that there are actually two kinds of tags, right? Some tags, when you put stuff inside of them, there's like an automatically like a new line. Like it's like you hit enter, right? That's what the paragraph tag does. With other tags, like the link tag, that doesn't happen, right? There's no automatic new line. And it'd be very annoying if the link tag did hit enter, because then you're like, that's not what I want. And the difference between this behavior is the difference between an inline and a block level element. So there are two key differences, two, very exciting. And the first is the one I just talked about. All elements that are block level automatically start a new line. So every time you create a new div, bam, an enter line is hit. And that's why in this example, there's just a bunch of like enters here. The difference is that an inline element doesn't do that. The other core and probably more important difference has to do with how it gets the width property. And we've now discussed the width property. We're with pros, so now we can talk about it. The width property, if you don't specify it for a block element, is the entire parent. So what that means is that it takes up as much space as possible, right? So for example, if we go to our little handy, oh, that's not what you want to see. If you go to our little handy inspect element here, and we inspect this header tag, even though the content of the tag only goes to the end of this A, right? This line extends all the way to the end of the page. And that's because the header tag is a block level tag. Does that make sense? And so if you added a border, where would the border be? Would it be at the end of the A or would it be at the end of the page? Peter has signed the end of the page. Can we get a confirmation on that, Peter?
That's what I meant, yes. But I was also like away from the keyboard for like the last couple minutes, so I may be wrong.
That's okay. This man is such a genius. He doesn't even need to listen to the entire thing. That's how good he is at HTML and CSS. But Peter is absolutely correct, right? if you have a header text, the border would go all the way around. Cool. Other elements, notably span, are not block by default. They're inline. And that just changes the behavior. So if you think about it, right, if you want to add a border just around the text here and not around the edge, how would you do that? How would you make that border go just around the text? Peter, you were muted if you were saying things.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to this one.
That's okay. It's okay. We still love you. Maya, do you have any thoughts? How could we add a box around just the text?
Some display property.
Yes. Yes, that is correct. So that's exactly what I was trying to get to, which is we can change the display of an element from being inline or block. The other solution, which is a creative one, is inside the heading tag, you can create another tag called the span tag or some other inline block element, and that will create a border around it as well. Yeah, that wasn't that exciting, but now you know. Why do I bring up inline and block? This actually governs how a lot of different things work. It's like super important in terms of, what's the word I'm trying to say? It's laying out and formatting things, because whether or not something is block and inline, as you see, can change how things like border, padding, margin, and all these other things affect it. The other property it affects is how automatic heights are set. And so we're going to do this with this nice little meme. So, okay, I have this image, right? This is Drake's album cover, but it's about Corona instead. And I want to center the image, okay? Let me just tell you a little piece of trivia. By default, the image tag is inline. So it only fills the width of the thing that we want. Does that make sense so far? Turns out, if you do it inline, there's no way to properly get this image to center properly with what we know so far. But if we instead make the image a block level image, and then we say, hey, let the image span the entire width of the container and fill in the margins equally, it kind of just works out and it gets centered like this. It doesn't get centered vertically. That's not a problem that Flexbox will solve, but it does get centered horizontally. And the code for that is this little snippet right here, image responsive. This is another snippet of CSS you'll see all over Stack Overflow, all over every CSS framework you use, like Bootstrap or Balma or Tailwind. So it's just kind of good to know that A, display block is involved, and B, there are some other properties here as well. So this is going to be sort of quick. I'm just going to tell you what's going on here. There's two new properties that we haven't learned about yet. There's the max width property. So the max width property says, hey, the width, if it's smaller than whatever the max width is, we're chilling, no problem. If the width is bigger, set it to the max width instead. So it kind of just, sets a max on the width. Bam, naming. So this makes sure that you don't go outside of your container, basically. 100% means we fill just to how wide the container is, or the parent. The auto property is very interesting. So the auto property basically just means, I don't really, I'll let the computer handle it. And the rules for auto are kind of strange. They're not written down. You kind of have to know how it works. But I'll give you a little bit of a secret. If you set the margin left and the margin right to both be auto, it'll center the thing. That's just how CSS works. The rendering engine property actually changes based on what browser you're using. But this specific thing is actually guaranteed, not by the W3 spec, but just turns out browsers do this. And there's more interesting information about how this works, but we don't have that much time. So you kind of just have to take my word for it. So this is a very common way that you'll scale something and then set it in the middle. And if you notice here, this is a secondary example. Here, this image is too big. It's gone outside the container. That's no bueno. But here, it's just the right size. And that's the max width property in action. Did that kind of make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. Cool, yeah. Okay. Great. So now we're going to switch and talk about the position property. So the position property affects the position of things. It's very surprising. Didn't expect it, That's a curveball. And I'm gonna go through the W3 demos because you can't demo these with screenshots, and you'll see why in a moment. By default, sorry, there are 5 values. We're gonna talk about all 5 of them. Static, relative, fixed, absolute, sticky. There's some experimental ones too, but we don't really care about those. Static is the default. So all we've done so far is what happens when position is equal to static. That's why we didn't write it. Does that make sense so far? So position static, lit, cool. Let's first discuss relative. And we'll do it in the context of this CSS class that says top, left. So these are new properties, top, left, right, bottom. As you can imagine, it's very common terminology you'll see all the time in CSS. And it expects a number that tells you how far away it is from something. So there's going to be some reference point, and you're going to put this element, and specifically this element's content area, that far away from the element that we're going to talk about in a moment. So this is 30 pixels from the top of the reference point and 45 pixels from the left of the reference point. Other than questions involving the reference point, are we still on the same page so far? We're telling you how far it is from a reference point. Great. The relative element says, hey, I want the reference point to be where the content area would have been. So position relative is useful for like shifting content a little, right? If you want to shift it 10 pixels or 5 pixels away from something, you would use position relative. So the W3 Schools example, this is the original div. So this is where the content is. But now we've shifted it to the left a little. So I have an interesting question for you. What is the difference between using this and changing the margin?
Like general margin or margin left?
Margin left. That's a good question. So what's the difference between using left 30 with relative and margin left?
It's part of the different tag then. It's in like a, instead of being part of the margin, now it's like, it's still part of content.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know.
That is okay.
I'm gonna think about it some more.
Okay, take some time. This one's a very, very tricky question. This is that critical thinking question. Eggert hits you like in your exam, and then you're very confused. This one really requires you to think about it for a bit. Okay, I'm gonna cheat and tell you part of the answer. Oh, Leisha says they affect the box sizing differently. Interesting. In this case, no. And the reason why is because A, box sizing only ever considers either the border, padding, and content, or just the content. So margin doesn't come into that question at all. That's a very good point to bring up. The kind of strange answer you probably weren't expecting is that there's not really that much of a difference. Functionally, other than obviously not being able to use the margin at a different value, position relative and margin actually functionally do almost the same thing. There's a little bit of some quirky edge cases that you'll find, but you have to intentionally come up with these edge cases. So normally, this is how it works. The one answer that I will tell you has to do with block elements. And if you remember, block elements, right, fill 100% of their parent, right? If you do position relative, that doesn't change the size of the parent or anything. So it'll still be the size of the parent when you shift it over. So it's going to bleed to the right a little. Does that make sense? And sometimes it can bleed and overlap over something. So that's the key difference. However, there's no way you would have known or thought about that. So don't worry about it. But now you know that's kind of the difference there. Sorry, a little convoluted. Didn't want to put any of you on the spot. But now you know, position relative. The other ones are a lot easier to think about. So one of them is position fixed. So position fixed says we're going to position this relative to your viewport, which is a nerd gatekeeping way of saying the edge of your browser. So if you notice, right, look at this Navbar right here, right? Or if you want to go to my Twitter again, right? Notice that even though I scroll throughout the page, right, these things aren't changing. These things aren't changing. This tweet header doesn't change. Do we all agree? You know, I'm going through my Twitter. Yes, I go to ACM AI. Bam, right? None of these things change. So this is where position fixed is very helpful, right? No matter what, it's fixed in place. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, cool. The next possible thing is position absolute. So absolute is kind of like fixed, but instead of the top of your browser, it's like the top of your page. And this is not entirely true. So by default, it's the top of your page. So if you think about it, you can like make your entire page just like one giant piece of paper, right? Then absolute would be based on the edges of that piece of paper. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. However, the people who made CSS were like, we also want some other functionality, which is that if we have a position relative element, we want to make that the anchor instead. And they just bundled it together in the same thing. So position absolute either picks the page, or if there's like a closer element, and by closer, I mean in that component tree. So if HTML is like the largest element, then you have body, then div, then paragraph, then span, then whatever. They pick the closest one that has position, not static. So relative, fixed, absolute, or sticky. They're like, Matt, that was extremely confusing. And I would say, yes, that is very confusing. I don't know why they couldn't just have made two different, anyways, besides the point. This is more common than you might imagine, but this use case is very strange. So I'm not gonna quiz any of you on it, but just something to think about. When you see position absolute, you need to find the closest parent that has the position something, and then you change that thing, and then that's now your reference point. Wow, okay, that was a lot. Last thing, not the least thing, is sticky. So sticky means that it's going to be relative until you scroll past it, then it becomes fixed. You're like, what does that mean? Let's take a look at this demo right here. So we got I am sticky, and then we scroll, and then now it sticks to the top. Does that make sense? This is a very, very common design pattern that you'll see. If you have like a table, and then you scroll through the table, you still want to see the header, right? Or else you'd be confused about what's in the table. That's where position sticky comes in. There are often these things that you'll see where you'll scroll past something and then it'll like stick on the top. That's position sticky as well. So that's how it kind of works. Look at this, this follow button, right? I'm not going to unfollow ACM AI ever though. But if you scroll, take a look, and ka-cha, right? That behavior is kind of like position sticky. It's actually not done with sticky, but it's the idea that you're looking for. Lit. Okay, any questions about position other than why is absolute a strange tag?
Wait, yeah, I didn't fully understand what absolute actually is.
Okay, yeah, I can go over it again. So absolute says we're looking for the reference point where top, bottom, left, and right are going to be based off of, right? Does that make sense so far? So absolute says, look at the tag's parent. Does that tag have a position thing set? Is it relative? That's not static. So is it like relative, fixed, absolute, or sticky? If it does, that element becomes the reference point. If that element is not the reference point, we're going to go up one again and check, does that one have position blah, 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 blah. And we keep on going up and up until we get to the entire page, and then the entire page is the default. Does that make sense?
So absolute is basically just relative to its parent?
To it, the first parent that has the position, not static.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of
So there's
confusing.
no way to like specify what you want it to attach to.
No. Yes, not exactly. At least not with what we have learned so far. We will eventually learn a way to do it. But for now, no, there is not. I mean, the other way you could specify it is just to make sure that everything between the thing you want to attach it to and your like thing has no position set. Then you've automatically set it. Does that make sense? Yes, so maybe so, Anisha? Yes, okay, cool. That was very confusing though. So thank you for bringing that up. Again, if anything else didn't make sense, please have me go over it. But I hate the position absolute tag and how it behaves. I wish it was more intuitive, but it's not. Also, Tim Gu is going to come at me now, so don't tell him I said that. Anyways, okay, last thing I want to talk about before we go through that quick example where I talk about stuff you can put on your personal website is float. I'm not going to spend that much time on float. This is kind of an opinionated thing, but I think that float is almost useless because the reasons that people used to use float are now replaced by sexy, modern solutions like Flexbox and CSS Grid. What does float do? So if you've ever used Microsoft Word, you had to put an image inside of a paragraph. Do you remember how much that sucks, right? Because like you move the image a little bit and then like half the page changes. So that is the behavior we want from position float. Float basically says, you can do either float left or float right. And it says, hey, we can kind of float things wherever we want, right? So if you look at this example, this is motivated like a lot of things from print media, right? If you have like this article, you want to put an image in the flow of the article, but you want to like go under afterwards. Does that make sense? So that's what float does. I'm not going to go over float in depth because of what I just said. I think that there are not that many reasons that you need to use float before. This thing is probably the only reason you need to use float anymore. Everything else is flexboxable. This page is then going to tell you, oh, but look at this. You can make a sidebar with float, and there's the main content. This is something that you should now do in Flexbox. And Leo will talk about that, I think, next week. So don't use float for these things. Don't. You used to have to. Now you don't. And then there's this thing called clearing. This is kind of confusing. People always got confused about this. When I first taught web development, I had to teach people all these kinds of things. They suck. Your life is very easy. Browsers support Flexbox now. And you're like, wow, Matt, that was not nice. You promised us something, you didn't teach it. And I'm like, well, it's Float's fault. Also, one thing I forgot to very briefly mention is that a great question you might have is, oh, if something is position fixed or absolute or relative, who decides what's on top, right? Like, how is this navbar on top of the stuff in the bottom? That's a really good question that I'm sure all of you had and just, didn't want to ask. And the answer is that there's this thing called z-index. So far, right, we've talked about width and height, but you can think of the HTML like page as like an XY axis thing, right? And if you do the right-hand rule, you got the X, you got the Y, you got the Z, bam, big lit. So Z is going to come out at you through the computer screen. And the z-index property is that axis. So the larger the number is, the like more on top it is, you know what I mean? And the lower the number is, the less on top it is. The default value is 0. And if you want to have a navbar, you'll set the z-index to be greater than 0, and then it'll be over all of the content. Does that make sense? Okay, that is all of the content that I had to cover today. Before I go on to the demo, does anyone have any other questions about stuff that we talked about today, or HTML or CSS in general? No? Okay, let's make a website. So this website is going to be called Origin's website, okay? So, oh. Okay, cool. So this is Origin's website, kind of a banger, already. He's a pretty cool guy. But we want to add some stuff that people are going to, recognize as familiar design patterns. So the first thing we can say is, hey, maybe I want to put text into like physical blocks because it's easier for people to see what I'm doing, right? Maybe you're listing your projects. Like maybe Arjun says here, like king of AI, right? That's one thing. And then he has this like tag here, and then let me just do this. Let's use good HTML practices. Sorry. I should have like maybe pre-typed out some of this stuff. You can do like ACM AI outreach head. Then he types in some stuff here, I teach beep bop. And then maybe he has an image here. I don't have an image, so I'm not gonna put one here. And then he does this again, and he talks about his research, maybe. Also, he does beep bop. That's not how you spell research. And then he's like, oh, I also really like running. I like running. Cool. So right now, the page looks like this. And this is not bad, but at the same time, you're like, I don't know, it's kind of visually not super distinct what's going on. So we want to make what's going to be called a card component, okay? So a card component is a really, really common design pattern you'll see. And a lot of people will say that Twitter made it really popular, which is maybe true because there's this guy called Mark Otto, and he worked at Twitter, and he made this thing called Bootstrap, and lots of people use it now. But we're going to make a class for a card. Okay, so we're going to jump into our CSS here. And I want to do a few things in this card. The most important thing I want to do is add a border. right? But if I add a border and I don't add any padding or margin, are we going to run into any problems? Before I show you on the screen, what are our thoughts? I see we have no thoughts. That's okay. Some people on Twitter would be very happy. Okay, so if we do that and refresh the page, there's no space in between each card, right? And the text on the left here hits the edge of the card. That's not what we want to see, right? So let's change that. First, I want to add space between the cards. What property would I use here?
Margin.
Yes, Maya. Thank you. Thanks. So let's add some margin. And in particular, I'm just going to add the margin bottom because I want there to be space in between the cards vertically, but I don't really want there to be space on the left and the right. We're going to fix that in a moment too. So yeah, let's set the margin bottom to be, I don't know, 20 pixels. Okay. So now we've got some space in between the cards. What about the inside? I want the text here to kind of, you know, not hug the edge of the border wall. How could I do that?
Padding.
Yes. Async outreach on top of the game. So this time I'm gonna use the entire padding thing, and I'm gonna do, I don't know, I'm gonna introduce a new unit. I'm gonna do 1 EM. So an EM, I think it stands for emit. I don't know why it's called emit, but an EM basically means 1 EM is the same as however large one character is in your block. That's useful because you can exactly space something by 1 letter. Anyways, now you know. But yeah, look at that. So now we've added some space. There's like too much space up here, but I don't know what's causing the space. How could I figure out what's causing all the space up here?
Is it the padding all around?
So you're jumping ahead of me. You already know the answer. I don't have enough brain cells for that. I need to actually physically see what's happening. Is there a tool in my browser that I could use to see what's causing the space?
You could use inspect.
Hallelujah. This is great. After Peter abandons me, I can only count on you two. And Lisha, of course. But yeah, if you see here, I can hover over the card and you can see that there are 2 things giving space in. So one is the padding that I added all around. And the other is the header has margin top, as you can see, right? And so margin and padding don't collapse. It's only margin and margin. So if I want to make this less awkward, I just need to change one of these 2 things. Does that make sense? Okay, so in this case, I'm going to remove the margin top on the header because it means I just get to flex more code. So I'm going to use a tag selector, which you should not do that often. I'm just going to say margin top 0. If I do that, now the card's kind of more equispaced. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. The next thing is I feel like this entire page is like too close to the edge of my browser, right? I want everything to be more centered. How can I do that?
Margin.
Where?
On the body tab. Right now.
Okay, okay. I might pick up what you're putting down. So what do I type here?
Just the margin and then like, I don't know, some pixels. That's what I would have done. Okay.
Well, the nice thing about what is we can try it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that worked. Interesting. The reason why this works is because body is a block level element. So what does that mean?
It takes up the whole space of its parent.
Yes, yes, and that includes the margin. And the parent of the body is the HTML tag. So the HTML tag takes up your entire browser, so body can do that. And you can set this to whatever you want. I'm gonna cheat a bit. I'm also gonna use the other thing we learned today, max width, which is saying I wanna make the content thing have a max width. Does that make sense? So I'm gonna set this to be, I don't know, 800 pixels. So if you notice, that kind of centers things here. Oh, that's not great because it's still hugging the edge. Did we learn a way we could center things, possibly using margin and something that's display block?
Something auto.
Beautiful. So I'm going to change Peter's code. It was lovely. It's not your fault. But I'm going to change this to margin left auto and margin right auto. And now it's going to horizontally center your new thing. So now this is looking more and more like some professor's random block, right? Cool. Okay, we're almost out of time. I just want to introduce one other thing, which is how can we add like a very simple navbar, right? Two things. I'm going to first just make way more cards that are going to be the same thing, just so we can illustrate the scrolling effect. No, it's still not enough cards. Sorry. I should have written a JavaScript for students. Anyways, so now we have some scrolling, right? But we want to have some stuff up here so we still know what's going on, right? How would we do that? Is there a CSS property we learned that can make sure that something's always on the screen?
Sticky.
Yes. But in this case, I kind of don't feel like using sticky. Actually, yeah, let's do sticky. Why not? I was going to say fixed. Fixed is the answer I was looking for, but they're both fine. So I'm going to do something. I'm going to use a custom tag called navbar or nav. This is the same thing as div, but this is used by screen readers. And it's like, oh, this is a navigation. There's quite a few of these. There's like header, footer, blah, blah, blah. Oh, actually, I think I want to use header here. You can just look these up. We're not ever going to grade you on this kind of stuff, but if you end up working professionally as a web developer, you need to worry about stuff like this. So we're going to do header, argin, subammonium. So if we do that, it's up here, right? That looks like a pretty crappy navbar. So I'm going to call this thing navbar. And we got to add a few things to it. So first, how are we going to make it sticky? With position sticky. Yes, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Solid work. So we're going to do that. And if you notice, uh-oh, that didn't work. One sec. Am I dumb? Give me a moment. Oh, sorry, my bad. I'm really dumb. You need to set top to 0, or else it doesn't know where it's going to be sticky from. Right? There you go. Did you see? We got that. Cool. Okay. But this is kind of bad, right? Like, it like goes over the text. Is there a way we could fix that problem? This is creative. We haven't talked about this in this lecture, but you did learn about it yesterday.
Could you just like put it in a box and make the background color white?
Yes. Yes. That's what I like to hear. Okay, let's do that. So let's make the background color white. So that fixes that first problem, right? If you notice, now nothing is wrapping over the text here. But how would we add a border or a box around it? Is there anything we learned to add a border or a box around something?
Border.
Maya, I want you on the Teacher Like Dev team. You're too good. So we have a few options here. So I'll show you what the overall border will look like. That's not what we want, right? We don't want that. So there's a few ways we can fix this. I'm just going to go through this because I think you've had enough of my convoluted exercises. So we have a few options to make this thing work properly. So one problem is that the overall body has a margin. So first we can just set margin top to 0. And this is where the inspect element tool really comes into touch, right? So now we have this thing. The next thing is we want to make this box bigger. Alicia, how could we make the navbar bigger?
You could manually set the size with the height or width properties.
that is one thing we can do. I like what you're thinking. So we can do height. 70 pixels is a very common size for a navbar. Oh no. That doesn't look good at all. I don't think Arjun would be happy with this. Is there another thing we could do instead to, I don't know, maybe center the thing? Starts with a P, ends in Paddington, but without the ington.
Padding.
Padding. Peter ran there. So there are two different ways you can do this. And if you want to center the, do what Lisha did, we can do that with Flexbox. We just haven't learned that yet. So we can do that, and that kind of centers the thing, right? And then you're like, oh, wow, well, that could probably be, you know, maybe we'll add a bit of padding on the left, you know, and maybe we'll turn this down to like 15. Okay, and then we should probably, I don't know, like make this bold, add some font size, right? And then as you can kind of see, you'll keep on adding stuff. So this is not a website that I would show Arjun. I feel like this is not enough to prove how awesome he is, but it did give you a bit of a head start, right? This is the kind of layout that you would normally use if you were writing a blog. You would have a header, maybe like a categories button here, or your GitHub, your LinkedIn, you know, stuff like that. And then you would just have little cards here. And if you go to some of the example sites that we talked about, right? Like Tristan Hume, this guy is a software engineer. He works at Jane Street, and he's from Canada, so go Canada. This kind of layout is almost identical in like the layout to what we just did over here, right? Obviously, his looks slightly better because, you know, he's not me. But the overall idea is really what we learned today. So the rest of the stuff, like changing the font or adding photos, this we haven't learned how to do this yet. So we'll talk about how to do like row, column kind of thing in a moment. But other than that, we've already gone over everything you need. And if you want a really, really simple site, like Mark Otto's site, this we actually are now basically already know how to do, right? A list of posts. This is just done with padding, with margin, this kind of whole situation here. This has to do with the margin auto and the max width we talked about. And yeah, so now you know how to do all this positioning and layout stuff. Overall, did that make sense? Any questions about the content we covered today or anything else you would like to know about web development? My DMs are also open. No one has slid in them in quite some time. Okay, seems like there are no other questions. For those of you watching at home, thanks for supporting us. Smash that subscribe button. Comment down below who your favorite person was, who you want to come back to the Bon Appetit test kitchen. And in the meantime, you can now use this stuff and work on that portfolio mini assignment that we talked about. This is one step there. And then if you want to join us again on Monday, I want to say, Leo and I are going to go over Introduction to JavaScript. And I'll give you a fun game to play. And it's going to be why JavaScript is so bad. But yeah, that's it. I'm going to stop the recording now. Oh no, how do I do that?